Welcome. I think it's a little bit ironic that the presentation on ADHD is the very last one, because for those of you who have ADHD and may have been participating over the last couple of days, you'll know that this is going to be a little bit challenging to pay attention for the duration. Anyhow, welcome. I'm Miriam Saunders, and I'm here to talk to you about mindfulness interventions for the treatment of ADHD. A little bit about myself, all the books, et cetera, aside. Roughly 30 years ago, I married a man with ADHD, and we went on to have 3 very challenging children. And while I was becoming a clinician was about the same time that they were getting diagnosed with, in fact, ADHD. And so I wound up specializing in ADHD, and most specifically the parenting of ADHD, to help myself, really. And what I learned and the way in which I learned about parent behavior therapy specifically really radically changed my own family. And so I'm very passionate about this work. So what we're going to be talking about today, I don't know how many of you are listening or what your backgrounds are. I don't know if you've come to this session because you're ADHD experts and you want to understand mindfulness interventions, or if you're mindfulness experts and you're curious about ADHD, or if you have ADHD yourself and you're hoping to, have some tips and tricks for your own tool bag. But what we're going to talk about today is a little bit of an ADHD refresher on what it is and how it might be impacting your clients. And then I'll move into how you might write or choose impactful mindfulness exercises for your clients. And then I have about 20 different mindfulness exercises that we can explore, given how much time we have at the end. So that's what we're going to be doing. So let's jump into the first mindfulness exercise. Now, I'm going to assume, because we're at the end of a 2-day mindfulness summit, that you're all at this point very familiar with the definition of mindfulness as being aware of your present moment, leaving judgment behind, that you've probably done about 1 million body scans by now, and that you're familiar with the 4-count box breath cycle. So I'm not going to take you through anything like that. I will reference those things with the assumption that you know what they are. But the mindfulness exercise I want to do with you right now is one that I call I Am Here. People with ADHD very often struggle with becoming easily distracted while trying to get a task done. And for those that might be sitting down in front of their computer to dive into a task that's going to take them a long time and might get easily distracted, this exercise can help bring an intentionality around what they're about to do, and remind them of where they are and what they're about to do. So what I'd like to start, I'm going to take you through this exercise, and what I'd like to start with are 3 4-count box breath cycles. So if you will, please, wherever you are, just take a moment to close your eyes. And we're going to start with the 3 breath cycles. So in, 2, 3, 4, out, hold, 2, 3, 4, out, 2, 3, 4. That's 1. In, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, out, 2, 3, 4. And last one, in, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, out, 2, 3, 4. Now, wherever you're joining us from today, whether it's at your computer, at a desk, or in your bed, or at the kitchen table, I want you to tap either the table or your bed or right next to you, I want you to tap and I want you to tell yourself, I am here. I am here. As a way of grounding yourself in this moment and reminding yourself of where you are and what you're doing. Then next, I want you to set an intention for the next 90 minutes. Your intention should be around something that maybe you anticipate struggling with. Maybe paying attention for the next 90 minutes is going to be challenging for you. So your intention is that you're going to try to stay focused on my voice. Or maybe you know you're going to need to stand up and take frequent breaks. So you're going to set your intention to be mindful around when you need those breaks. Whatever your intention is for the next 90 minutes, set it now. And then for the next 20 seconds, I want you to repeat this intention to yourself, either silently or out loud. And I'll let you know when the 20 seconds are over. Okay, I'll take one last deep breath in and exhale. And if during the next 90 minutes, you find yourself straying from your intention, without judging yourself for having strayed, simply return back to the intention, tap, I am here, reset the intention, and start all over again. Okay, so that's an example of the type of thing that I might use with an ADHD client to help them. It's something they can take home with them and do during the day at work, or to help them get through tasks. But so let's get on with it. Let's talk about what ADHD is. There are 3 different kinds: hyperactive impulsive, inattentive, and combined type, which, as the name sounds like, is a combination of both hyperactive and inattentive. In order to receive the diagnosis, you need to have 6 of 9 symptoms from either category, 5 if you're an adult. The symptoms have to have appeared before the age of 12, and they also need to appear in 2 different settings. So in other words, if you have a client who reports that they just struggle at work, they can't pay attention, they suspect they might have ADHD, but it doesn't show up anywhere else in their life. They never have those similar kinds of problems at home or with friends, then it might not be ADHD. The symptoms also have to interfere with or reduce one's quality of life. So they can't just have the symptoms, they really have to be impairing on top of that. And then the DSM specifies that it could be mild, moderate, or severe. At this stage, the CDC estimates that upwards of 10% of the population might have an ADHD diagnosis. So this is a summary of the symptoms from the DSM. The hyperactive impulsive list includes things like fidgets, leaves the seat often, runs about, not quiet, on the go, or acts as if driven like a motor, talks too much, blurts things, difficulty waiting, interrupts frequently. You can see that this symptom list was really catered towards children in mind when it was written. But it doesn't mean that adults don't experience similar hyperactive type things. It just might not be, running about and leaving their seat often. Maybe they'll drive too fast, or they might have a lot of trouble sitting still and not shaking their knee in a meeting. Over on the inattentive side, where we see symptoms like frequent careless mistakes, difficulty sustaining attention, wandering mind, difficulty finishing tasks, keeping oneself organized, sustaining those tasks, frequently losing things, easily distracted, and forgetful. And then there's a combination of both of those things. So for diagnosing ADHD, the thing is there is no blood test or no objective test. It's always going to be some kind of clinical exam. So you might be the one diagnosing your client based off of these 6 of 9 symptoms in the DSM. It could be done through behavioral observation. For example, in the case of children, often clinicians will go to class, or the school psychologist might look at them behaviorally. There are rating scales that are used to diagnose ADHD, such as the Conners, the Basque, the Vanderbilt, which are lengthier questionnaires that parents and teachers will fill out. If you want a very extensive diagnosis, really the best approach is to do a neuropsycho eval by a psychologist. And that's going to be really thorough because it's also going to get at the underlying processes that are informing the symptoms that we see, whether it's working memory or visual or auditory processing issues and things like that. At this stage, there are some mavericks out there in the Wild West trying to develop the ability to diagnose ADHD via brain scans and genetic testing and things like that. But at the moment, there isn't anything that I'm aware of that substantiates the ability to reliably diagnose ADHD in those ways. Things that aren't talked about in the DSM, but that would plague your ADHD client are things like sleep-wake cycle issues. Studies show that people with ADHD have a tendency to release melatonin later in the day, which means that their ability to fall asleep will also happen later in the day. So frequently people with ADHD complain about having difficulty falling asleep during times when they want to be falling asleep. And they might stay up until 1, 2 o'clock in the morning before they naturally feel like falling asleep. I like to tell those clients, this isn't necessarily a mindfulness thing, but exposure to sunlight in the morning will help to increase serotonin, which impacts the release of melatonin later. So when talking about mindfulness and meditation with your client, suggesting perhaps if they have a morning practice to doing it outside in the sun might be something that ultimately helps them later with sleep. People with ADHD also are highly sensitive to rejection very often. It's something called rejection sensitivity dysphoria. It's not in the DSM, but it is definitely a term that's talked about a lot lately. Radar is just very, very on alert to the possibility of rejection, and it's often seen where it isn't intended. So it can often contribute to self-esteem issues in clients. There can often be a lot of social problems. If you have trouble paying attention and you miss social cues or you miss what somebody said, then it might be very challenging to keep up socially. People with ADHD have been known to be what's called super tasters, and some people think that they might actually have more taste buds per capita. I haven't found any scientific proof that this is actually true, but I do have a lot of anecdotes from my own life and from clients, which often can make feeding ADHD children and eating as an adult challenging because you're highly sensitive to taste. That goes along with other sensory issues, highly sensitive to light, sounds, textures. A lot of the impulsive symptoms and inattentive symptoms can often look like defiance. And people with ADHD often have emotional regulation issues as well. And so they are seen as angry. They're also seen often as noisy and annoying because they have trouble controlling impulses around making noises. And they may frequently stim. Stimming is short for self-stimulation. It is most commonly thought of in the autism world, having to do with arm flapping and rocking, but stimming is actually something we all do. If you twirl your hair, or you tap your knee, or you tap, the pen on the desk, that is stimming. People with ADHD will often get a lot of their energy out by doing stimming things like tapping and shaking their knee, which can sometimes bug other people. And then a lot of the issues around inattentiveness can make sustaining certain jobs really difficult. So people with ADHD have a tendency to have higher rates of job loss and then higher rates of accidental death due to some of the impulsivities leading to higher rates of risk taking. So these might be some of the things that your clients are grappling with. Now, in the psychoeducation piece with clients, I always love to start with neuroscience because so much of ADHD is misunderstood and it's thought of as a behavior disorder. It's also thought of as something that you should be able to control. Just try a little bit harder. But if you understand the brain science piece of what is happening and why these symptoms are happening, I find that it allows adults with ADHD to have a little more self-compassion and parents of children with ADHD to also have a little bit more compassion with some of the behaviors they're really struggling with in their children. So it turns out that we are able to see activity in the brain that relates to something we call executive functioning. Executive functioning happens in the prefrontal cortex area of the brain. And when we do a brain scan on somebody diagnosed with ADHD and compare it to a brain scan of somebody, a neurotypical brain without ADHD, we can see that the prefrontal cortex area does not light up as much in the ADHD brain. And this prefrontal cortex area is responsible for what we call executive functioning, and I'll get into a description of what that is in a moment. What we believe is happening is this prefrontal cortex needs neurotransmitters, namely dopamine and norepinephrine, to become stimulated and do its job. And in the ADHD brain, it isn't getting as much dopamine and norepinephrine as it needs in order to do the tasks that are being required of it. And so it results in somewhat of a sluggish response. Additionally, we also see from brain scans that the prefrontal cortex area seems to be anywhere from 1 to 3 years behind in maturation and development, which is really important when you think about children and a 12-year-old whose brain is really maybe a little bit more like a 9-year-old when it comes to executive functioning, but it's still being asked to do 12-year-old things on a daily basis, which is very different from what a 9-year-old might be asked to do. So what is this executive functioning that we talk about? It is all of the things that the ADHD brain struggles with, all of the symptoms from the DSM. Executive functioning is the ability to plan and organize something long-term. This is where we are able to regulate big emotions in the face of something that maybe somebody else might not think is such a big deal. I remember when my daughter was younger, she was about 9, and we were going to have pizza for dinner. And at the last minute, we had to change it to Chinese food because the pizza place was closed. And you would have thought we just murdered her puppy, because the meltdown that resulted because of that was like astronomical. She just could not handle the change. And any other kid might have been like, oh, I don't care, I like Chinese food. But that change for her was something her brain has set her brain on fire, basically. And it almost started like a threat defense response in her brain. This part of the brain also manages working memory. So that's the ability to remember what you just learned, like multi-step directions. So if you tell someone with ADHD, hey, Bob, could you take this, run it over to Sally's desk, ask her, what she thinks of memo number 3, and then could you run it over to the copy machine and meet me back here in 5 minutes? Bob is probably going to hear, hey, Bob, and the rest of it just went somewhere else. If you're lucky, he might have heard the first or the last thing that you said. And so this is really challenging for somebody with ADHD. Executive functioning also relates to self-control and setting a pause button, stopping, checking in with yourself. Hey, maybe it's not going to be a good idea to blurt this thing out. It might be hurtful. A neurotypical brain has that luxury of pausing and realizing, like, oh, critical thinking moment, that would be bad, and then not doing it. But someone with ADHD doesn't have that pause button, and it just happens. Attention, I think, is self-explanatory, but one thing that's really important to understand about attention with ADHD is, and I get a lot of parents who say, my kid can't have ADHD. They can do Legos for hours. They can play video games for hours. Well, the reason for that is because when we're doing something that is pleasurable, our brains create dopamine, because dopamine is the pleasure neurotransmitter. And so if your body is naturally creating dopamine because you're interested in what you're doing, then you're not going to have problems paying attention because your prefrontal cortex is getting the dopamine it needs. So right now, as I speak, if you're riveted by my voice and you think the subject matter is amazing, you're having no problem paying attention if you have ADHD. But if I've droned on a bit too long, you might already be thinking about your weekend plans. Sorry. The next issue is time management. So people with ADHD seem to really struggle with understanding what the physical passage of time feels like. So if you say, meet me here in 5 minutes to a child with ADHD, you might as well be saying, meet me here in 1,000,000 minutes. It's just a really difficult concept to embody. And then lastly, flexible thinking. I think because of maybe the need to control what feels like a chaotic world, often this lends to a rigidity around thinking and an inability to see the gray and think flexibly. So an analogy that I like to use that's sometimes helpful for my clients is that for a person with ADHD, it's as if every day they're being asked to drive across country, but they only have been given 1 tank of gas and their technology is lagging. And they're having to run this race against peers that have full tanks of gas and the most up-to-date technology. For people like that, they're always going to feel a little bit behind, a little bit like they don't belong, a little bit like everyone else is getting it and they're not, and they don't quite understand why. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about fact versus fiction in the ADHD world, because there is a lot of fake news out there with ADHD. And I think if you're working with clients that may have it, it's important for you to understand where their own objections might be and where they might be facing objections in life. The first one is this notion that ADHD is not a real medical disorder. It does lack biological validity, right? There's no blood test for it, but it does have diagnostic reliability in the sense that any 2 clinicians would likely diagnose ADHD if given the same set of symptoms. Another argument is that it's health medication. And so if medication can act on the physiology to give the body a level playing field, then the argument would be that there's a physiological cause. And then the last one that I always like to remind clients about is that insurance companies will reimburse for the ADHD diagnosis. And if it wasn't a real medical disorder, they probably wouldn't part with their money. The next one is that ADHD is a modern farce created by drug companies. And I don't want to get into, whether drug companies are big bad wolves. That aside, the fact is that clinicians, doctors have been noting symptoms that look like ADHD well before drug companies existed. There's a German doctor who wrote a lot about a patient he called Fidgety Phil, and another one called Johnny Looks in the Air. And I think he even wrote poems about them. But doctors have been making note of these symptoms for historically a very long time. So this was not invented by drug companies. This is a big one. And I do not believe that ADHD is overdiagnosed, but I will say that it is probably very frequently misdiagnosed. And the reason for that is because very often a child will be brought to the pediatrician by their parent, and for the pediatrician to diagnose it, they will give the parent and the teacher a checklist, and if you check off 6 symptoms, bam, you have an ADHD diagnosis. But there are a lot of other things that ADHD can be, and I'll get into that in a moment, that could be physiologically caused and maybe look like ADHD. And so given how easy it is to just check off these symptoms without really uncovering if there might be something else causing them, then it could be extremely easy to land into a misdiagnosis. But I also like to point out to clients that there are a lot of things that get misdiagnosed. I looked it up: lupus, strokes, MS, Lyme disease. They all very easily get misdiagnosed, but it doesn't make them any less of a valid diagnosis. It's due to bad parenting. It's not. I'm just going to simply say it's not. Parenting can greatly influence behaviors and also how the child feels about themselves for these behaviors they can't control. But it certainly is never going to cause ADHD. It does not affect only boys. Boys have a greater diagnostic rate than girls. No one's really sure why. And it does seem as though girls tend to be diagnosed more with the inattentive kind than with the hyperactive kind. But it does impact girls as well as boys. I just talked about this with the Legos and the video games, but that's frequently an argument that I'll hear, and then that's when I go to the neuroscience and explain about the dopamine. Unfortunately, no, you don't outgrow an ADHD diagnosis. It is a neurological condition, and so it is lifelong. However, we do see that the hyperactive symptoms have a tendency to wane as someone gets older. The prefrontal cortex consolidates, in your mid to late 20s. And so there seems to be maybe an increased ability to calm the hyperactive pieces, but also to channel them into perhaps more functioning ways, and to just learn greater coping mechanisms. ADHD meds lead to drug use. That's a big fear for parents, especially who are considering medication for their children. All the studies that I found indicate that, in fact, it is the opposite, that ADHD children are at greater risk for substance abuse later, especially if they are unmedicated, because they're seeking to self-medicate as they get older, and so they're more likely to use substances to self-medicate. But medication, in fact, seems to be a protective factor against that later substance use. Accommodations for ADHD are an unfair advantage. And though that's something I'll often hear from parents of neurotypical kids at SAT time who think that it's not fair that the ADHD kid got time and a half on their tests. But what it's actually doing is leveling the playing field. The accommodations are just to make sure that everything is fair and there's equity. People with ADHD are lazy and need to try harder. And that couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, I think that people with ADHD actually are some of the more hardworking people because they have so many more obstacles to overcome and need to try harder just to get something regular done. And it certainly, laziness has nothing to do with one's ability to manage your own neurology. You know, it sort of just is what it is. And a lot of these things are beyond someone's control. And then this is the last myth. I love this one. Somebody wrote an article years ago. I think that might have been a French mom who claimed that, you know, her kids, that no one in France has ADHD and it's just a strictly a US parenting problem. But the reality is that worldwide statistics are pretty consistent. So it doesn't have to do with culture, parenting. It is just a human biological problem. So, as clinicians, you might find yourself either with a client who comes to you with an ADHD diagnosis and that's why they're there, or you're working with them on something else and you begin to suspect that maybe ADHD is at play. So it's going to be important to assess for co-occurring disorders and for other causes. Possible other causes, your physiological rule-outs are going to be things like allergies, sleep disorders, fetal alcohol syndrome, and things like sleep apnea. They can all also cause symptoms that look like ADHD symptoms. Learning disabilities, auditory processing problems, dyslexia, that can also look like somebody who has attention problems. Autism spectrum disorder. There are some overlapping symptoms, and sometimes the rigidity and the hyperfocus of ASD can maybe look like ADHD symptoms. And then other mental health disorders, depression, anxiety, trauma, bipolar, can all also cause inattentiveness and things that might look like, especially inattentive ADHD. So being aware and making sure that the ADHD isn't actually these things first could be important. And then these are ADHD's best friends. There is a lot of co-occurrence of ADHD and autism spectrum disorder. Anxiety and depression are huge, as you know, is understandable. If you're moving through the world, especially as a formerly undiagnosed adult with ADHD, it can be very anxiety provoking to feel as though the rest of the world gets what's going on and you don't, that you're left behind, that you're constantly struggling in school or at work. And that could also lead to a feeling of giving up and depression. A lot of learning disorders, dyslexia accompany ADHD, later substance abuse, as we just discussed. Oppositional defiant disorder is frequently diagnosed alongside ADHD. I personally have feelings around the ODD diagnosis because I very strongly feel that most of a child's defiance is coming from unmanageable requests. And if the environment and the requests were changed and accommodated, their ADHD was accommodated, we wouldn't be seeing such opposition and defiance from these children. And then we do see OCD as well, obsessive compulsive disorder. The typical treatment for ADHD, medication, stimulant medication, things like Ritalin, Concerta, Adderall, you've probably heard of those. Stimulant medication is fast acting. There's medication that lasts for 3 hours, and then there are extended release versions that might last for up to 12 hours. They have the 3-hour version has is, as I mentioned, it's fast acting. But then there's a non-stimulant kind that does take time to work itself up into the body and will take maybe the course of several weeks before you'll see its impact. Those are things like Strattera, excuse me, Quelby, clonidine, guanfacine. This medication can be delivered via patches, pumps, and pills is the most common. And then common side effects for this type of medication, the biggest one is loss of appetite. And that can make a lot of parents in particular hesitant to put their growing children on this medication. A lot of adults like it. It's great diet control. And then, especially given time of day that it's taken, it can contribute to more sleep problems. Some parents that have children that have difficulty waking up in the morning will give them the patches or give them the pill right away to sort of help them wake up in the morning. Common therapies for ADHD, aside from the mindfulness ones that I'm about to give you, are parent behavior therapy. So that's working directly with the parent to try to affect change in the home. Parent-child interaction therapy, if you're not aware of what that is usually done with a two-way mirror, and the therapist is behind with a headset on, watching the parent and the child as they interact, and the therapist is giving the parent cues through the headset on what to say and what to do. Applied behavioral analysis, ABA, most commonly used for children with an autism spectrum diagnosis, but it is also sometimes used for children with ADHD as a way of training behavior and shaping behavior. Cognitive behavioral therapy is probably the most commonly used, especially with adults. And then there are some interventions within the Gestalt and narrative therapies, which Gestalt especially can help with mindfulness in the here and now, and narrative can help with externalizing and doing, which I will get to in a little bit with some of the mindfulness exercises, but understanding that the person isn't defined by their ADHD, but that ADHD is something that comes and goes. There are a lot of alternative treatments to ADHD, and especially if you're working with parents of ADHD kids, there can be a tendency to want to explore a lot of those alternatives because they really are hesitant to give their children scary sounding medication that has the word, methamphetamine in it. And they're also sort of hopeful that there might be some kind of a cure for these symptoms. And so they'll try things like neurofeedback, brain games, binaural beats, which is this unusual sounding music that purports to be able to change your brain waves, homeopathy, chiropractic, there's a light goggle therapy, there's interactive metronome therapies, and then there are always people who are pushing diet, supplements, getting rid of food dyes and sugar and things like that. Unfortunately, and I'd be happy to hear from audience members if they know otherwise, in my research, I have not been able to find any evidence-based trials that really, conclusively show that any of these alternative treatments work definitively and long-term for ADHD symptoms. However, there have been studies done that show that things like martial arts, yoga, routine exercise, being out in nature, executive functioning coaching, and, in all caps, mindfulness can help with ADHD symptoms. Which brings us to that section of our presentation. So, if you are working with a client with ADHD, one of the first things that will be important to understand is, are you treating their ADHD, or are you treating the emotional impact that they have because of having possibly lived a life up to that point without having been diagnosed? Especially for people who were not ever diagnosed as a child, who never had their ADHD accommodated in school, it's very likely that part of what they're grappling with are some pretty deep-seated self-esteem issues. there was one estimation done that by age 10, a child with ADHD had heard, upwards of 20,000 criticisms just in school alone. And so constantly being corrected, constantly feeling out of place, can really land an adult with ADHD feeling like they somehow are the cause. And those feelings can lead to a lot of shame around symptoms and their inability to pay attention to get things done. Guilt for the same reason. They might be dealing with substance abuse that they, may or may not be willing to admit to. They might have suicidal thoughts. They might very much feel socially isolated. Maintaining relationships for some people with ADHD can be really challenging because their symptoms often get in the way. And then, of course, all of these things would lead to an increased stress level. So all of those things can be helped with a mindfulness practice, but if you suggest that to your client with ADHD, do not be surprised if they head for the hills, because, as you can imagine, the notion of mindfulness and meditation for somebody who finds it very challenging to sit still and very challenging to pay attention might seem like an absolutely impossible task. So when broaching the subject of mindfulness and meditation with your client, you're going to need a little bit of psychoeducation around what mindfulness is and what it isn't. And extremely important would be explaining to them that you're not suggesting that they sit in the lotus position with their minds empty for a half an hour and that somehow that's going to magically help them. So you might want to have a brief discussion around the fact that there are a lot of different kinds of meditation, and that some of them are clear mind meditations, but others might involve repeating a mantra to yourself over the course of the day, or maybe listening to certain sounds, doing particular movements. But that really what we're focusing on mostly is developing a mindfulness and doing certain exercises that will strengthen that mindfulness muscle. So why would we want to do that? Well, the goal of treatment is symptom reduction, and the primary way to reduce these symptoms for somebody with ADHD is to make them aware that they're happening in the first place, and that's the biggest challenge, because people with ADHD frequently just move through the world on autopilot, right? Their head is in the clouds, they're thinking about something else while they should be doing the task at hand. And so strengthening that awareness, what am I doing right now? What am I doing right now? What am I feeling right now? What am I supposed to be doing right now? Is something that's ultimately really going to help to begin to shift some of those autopilot tendencies and some of those symptoms that are getting in the way. And then because of a lot of the guilt, shame, and self-esteem issues that come along with having ADHD, the notion of mindfulness being aware of your present moment, but agreeing with yourself that you're going to leave judgment behind, that you're not going to criticize yourself or make any commentary in your mind about how you show up to this present moment, can really go a long way for people with ADHD, because they will be the first to cut themselves down when they realize, oh, I'm not paying attention. I'm supposed to be paying attention, right? So as clinicians, if we're reminding them to let that piece go, right? It's not helpful. It's not necessary right now. And the mindfulness practice is agreeing to let that piece go, then it can help with self-esteem. There are actually evidence-based studies that have been done that show, that mindfulness practices actually help to strengthen the prefrontal cortex. And so that is only going to help somebody with ADHD who's already challenged with the prefrontal cortex part of the brain. And then additionally, that mindfulness exercises do help people with ADHD. It helps to increase executive functioning capacity, right? Because that's what the prefrontal cortex does. And then a mindfulness practice often has a lot to do with intention setting. Just like I asked you in the I am here exercise. How's that going, by the way? You still with me? That people with ADHD, these mindfulness exercises are helping to, constantly remind them of their intentions in any given moment and what it is they're trying to accomplish, to continue to bring that awareness. As I mentioned, probably beating a dead horse at this point, but it can also help to increase self-esteem because we're leaving the judgment behind. Mindfulness exercises can also help increase a sense of agency, right? So as people begin to see, wow, I actually can be aware, I can leave judgment behind, I can notice when my attention has started to wander, then that can lend itself toward feeling more confident. Mindfulness exercises, because they can help reduce stress, reduce anxiety, they can also help strengthen one's ability to regulate their own emotions. And often simply becoming aware of one's own emotions, because ADHD people are often on autopilot, just becoming aware of the emotions in the first place can begin to strengthen your ability to manage them better. And then I think we're all pretty familiar with the fact at this point that mindfulness exercises can help physically reduce stress. Okay, so let's talk about some specific tools. Hopefully, over the course of the last 2 days, you have received a whole host of different types of mindfulness exercises that you can use with anxiety and trauma and things like that. And you'll probably find that some of these scripts could lend themselves very well to your client with ADHD, and maybe just with some minor tweaking. And so I absolutely invite you to keep your client in mind and come up with your own mindfulness exercises for you to use with your client in session and for them to use at home. You'll find that the typical exercises that are focused on body and breath will lend themselves to creating more somatic awareness in your client. And the exercises that help with somatic awareness can often be your first sort of trigger warning for your ADHD client that things are about to go awry for them. Because so much of life is done on autopilot, having that connection between what the body is feeling and what the brain is doing can be a great, first like canary in the coal mine for your client. So if, for example, they're able to become more aware of the pain in their neck, oh, well, that pain in my neck, I'm aware of that. And now I'm checking in with what I'm doing in this moment because I've been hunched down looking at my phone. Oh, I'm not supposed to be doing that. I'm supposed to be doing something else, right? So this is, that alone, that somatic awareness can be the thing that helps them become aware that they're not paying attention or doing what they intended to be doing. Stopping and noticing exercises. Those are the kinds, I'll be showing you some examples of those, but they're going to allow your client to reflect on what they're doing, what their intentions were, and what they're feeling in the moment. And then mantra meditations can be really great for helping to increase self-compassion, increase agency, and allow your clients to feel more empowered. If you're going to write your own mindfulness meditations, I would recommend that you keep them short. for obvious reasons. That you always start them with, like I did with you in the I am here exercise, start with either some breath cycles or a body scan, because just like I said, the more somatic awareness you can bring to your client, the more helpful that will be. You might, if you're doing them in session, then you might want your client to either record you with their phone so that they can use it at home, or if you are delivering this meditation to them in a variety of ways, which is often very helpful for the ADHD client. So for example, are you writing it down and giving it to them, or are you going to read it out loud? If you're writing it down, then you might suggest that at home they record it into their phone so that then they can listen to it and practice it without having to read it. Don't be afraid to get up and move in your session with your ADHD client. You know, if you meet in person or even online, we're so talk-based that unless we're working with children, we don't typically think about movement in our sessions. But with your ADHD client, it might be really helpful to be very mindful yourself of taking breaks in the session and suggesting you get up and stretch. If you meet in person, you might consider walking meditations. Some clinicians aren't comfortable with that for confidentiality reasons, and other clinicians I know take their clients outside all the time. But a walking meditation could be a great exercise for your client. And then if they're open to mindfulness practices, then suggest that they incorporate it into a routine at home. Clients, people with ADHD often find that routine and structure can really help minimize symptoms and help them manage their executive functioning. So incorporating their practices into a routine. So first thing when you wake up in the morning, or as soon as you get home from work, or things like that. But in your sessions, because people with ADHD can often want to chase shiny new objects and get bored with things pretty quickly, you might want to stray from doing the same repetitive mindfulness exercises and maybe consider changing it up to keep them interested. And then always close your exercise with another maybe body scan or feeling check. You know, how are you feeling as a result of finishing this exercise? And then frequent reminders that mindfulness exercises don't include any self-judgment. All right, so let's get into some specific exercises. Mindfulness exercises that can help to calm the body. Obvious ones, box breathing and body scan exercises. Okay, those are like gimmies. But this next one I call shake, shake, shake. And, you know, if you're feeling a little crazy, you can do this with your client, or it can just be something you suggest that they do at home. But it is what it sounds like. So you're going to suggest that your client get up, stand up, and then take a few breath cycles and pay attention to any tension that they're feeling in the body. And then they're going to start to move. But I mean, really move. Like, you're going to suggest to them that they make sure that they are in a safe space to do this and that they're not going to hurt themselves, but that they start to flail their arms about, move their legs, really try to get as much energy out as possible in this shaking. And for some reason, shaking like this for as ever long as they would like to shake for has the effect of calming the body down after you're done. It's a great way of releasing any pent-up energy. People with ADHD often have a lot of energy, excess energy that they really need to figure out ways to get out. So if you just kind of allow yourself to just let it all go and get it out, then they might be able to then sit down and pay attention to whatever task that they have to do next. Forest bathing, if you're not aware of it, I'd be really surprised if nobody's brought it up over the last 2 days. But studies have shown that for children in particular, being out in nature has an effect of reducing ADHD symptoms. Forest bathing is the act of a meditative mindfulness practice while you're out in nature, and it is being aware of the sights, sounds, temperature, any feelings that are happening while being out in nature. So if you're inclined to take your client for a walk and you have nature nearby, that could be something that you do together. For people that don't have access to nature, you can go online, go into YouTube, Google forest bathing, and there are videos that will come up that people have posted of calming, river sounds and things like that. So that you could do that with your client in session, or you could suggest they do that at home. Imaginary stimming. So if you recall, I mentioned stimming is short for self-stimulation, and it is a way for the body to get rid of excess energy. So your clients might frequently shake their knee or want to tap, but oftentimes in certain settings, those kinds of movements aren't appropriate, right? So if you're in a business meeting and you're like in a rage shaking your knee, you might really be bugging some of the other people in the meeting and you can't do it. So the imaginary stimming exercise is in those moments to instead visualize yourself doing the stimming that you really want to be doing. Suggest to your client that they take, so you can practice this with them so that in those moments they can do it on their own, but that they take a few breath cycles and then imagine themselves, visualize the stimming that they want to be doing, and note whatever's coming up for them feeling wise and in their body around this visualization, and then really breathe into that part of the body that so desperately wants to move, and release, and again check in with them around the feeling in that body as they're breathing out, and trying to breathe out that energy rather than getting it out through whatever body part wants to move. Sometimes this can be helpful for getting the body through those moments. Exercises to increase executive functioning. So there's the I am here one that I took you through at the beginning. Pomodoro meditation. So the Pomodoro technique, for those of you who work in the ADHD field already, you're already well aware of what the Pomodoro technique is. It is a way of working for people with ADHD that helps them to stay on task. And so, and I invite you to Google it. I won't get into it too much here, but for Pomodoro meditation, what we're doing is suggesting to the client that they set a timer for a short amount of time that they're going to be doing a practiced meditation, and suggest that this practiced meditation be perhaps one where they're in a seated position with a straight back, and they're really trying to pay attention to their breath for the duration of the time that they've set the timer to. So let's just say they're starting with 3 minutes. So you set a timer for 3 minutes, and you do some breath cycles where the goal is to pay attention to the breath. And if they're unable, if they find within those 3 minutes that their mind has wandered, they simply write down the thought that they had, and then they bring themselves back to the breath. And again, reminding them there's no judgment for the fact that you couldn't pay attention to your breath for 3 minutes and you had a distracting thought. That the idea is that if you write the distracting thought down, you can somehow park it and then come back to the meditation. And then you reset the timer for another 3 minutes. The goal over time is to increase that amount of time. And so this can really help to strengthen one's ability to pay attention even to something that's not necessarily very stimulating, like the breath. So that's what Pomodoro meditation is. The finish line is another great one. So people with ADHD often struggle with finishing a task. And sometimes it's because either we tend to be perfectionists. And I'm using we because I think I forgot to mention I also have ADHD, but yes, I do. We tend to really want the end product to be perfect and can't imagine getting it to that perfect state. And so that lends to just never trying to begin with. So the first step is the most difficult because we can't even envision what the last step looks like. We can't imagine getting perfect. Or the first step is really hard because the whole thing seems absolutely overwhelming. And so this is a visualization exercise for clients that might be struggling in that way, to ground themselves in their body, take some breath cycles, and then walk them through a visualization of what does the end look like? Whatever it is you're trying to get to, whatever your goal is, imagine yourself having already completed it. You're done. You got there. It's perfect. And everyone's cheering you. You did a great job. Really walk them through this visualization. Ask them what it feels like. Where do they feel it in their body? And then bring them back and suggest to them that before they start any task, especially one that feels really difficult, that they take themselves through this kind of visualization of what the end product looks like, having successfully completed it. Because sometimes that imagining where I'm going is the thing that can allow them to take the first step. The EF constellation. So this stands for Executive Functioning Constellation. For this, I like to print out a list of the various executive functioning challenges, like some of the ones I talked about earlier. And if you need a list, you can Google it and then print that out for your client. And I hand that to the client and I ask them to circle the various ways, the various ones that they feel apply to them. And then I take them through a visualization where we do some grounded breathing first. And I tell them to imagine that they've cast this list of executive functioning challenges into the sky, and that the night sky above them, the constellation that they see before them, is their executive functioning constellation. And they didn't ask for it. It's just the one that they happen to have. And it doesn't hold any meaning around who they are or what they're capable of. They don't need to identify with these challenges. This constellation is just part of their makeup, the same as their hair color, eye color, their height, and things like that. And so with this understanding that this constellation just makes up part of who they are and not the entirety of who they are, that they can invite compassion into themselves in that moment, and accept themselves for this constellation that they didn't ask for. I am thinking of one is, oh yeah, okay. So this is similar to the Pomodoro meditation one, and you can do this with your client. So you're going to take them through a mindfulness meditation, maybe a breath meditation, have them focus on their breath. And then whenever they have a distracted thought, they're going to say out loud, without opening their eyes or stopping the meditation, they're just going to say their thought out loud, and you're going to write it down. And then they're going to come back to their breath cycle and paying attention to their breath. It's similar to the Pomodoro meditation one. A mindful habit. This is an exercise for clients who are struggling with maybe a challenging habit that they have that they can't seem to break themselves from. So for example, maybe they can't stop looking at their phone during family dinner time. Like they're a little bit addicted to their phone. So you're going to take them through an exercise where they, again, all of these should start with like breath cycles or a body scan or a check-in around where they're feeling tension in their body. And then you move into the visualization around having them visualize the family dinner moment, visualize the moment where they have this habit. And then ask them what comes up for you emotionally as you visualize yourself doing this. Look around you, who's with you, what are you doing, and then what are you touching, what do you smell in the air? And then in this moment, as you are frequently inclined to do this bad habit, can you make a different choice? Can you visualize yourself making a different choice? So if it's, looking at the phone during dinner, can you visualize yourself putting the phone on the kitchen counter on silent, and then coming back to the dinner table and engaging in conversation with your family? Again, so it's a lot of visualization. The stop exercise, this can be really helpful if you work with kids, but there are a lot of adults that really love this one too. For this, you got to get out your craft supplies. So you're going to get out paper and specifically red and black markers, because you're going to have your clients draw stop signs. But while they're drawing, you want to have them be doing very mindful drawing. So bring them very much to the exercise of, what does the marker feel like as it touches the paper? Where is my mind wandering as I'm drawing this stop sign? What am I feeling? What am I smelling? What am I touching? Exactly, making them stay in the moment of drawing this stop sign. And then the suggestion is, once they've drawn several stop signs, they post them up in their homes in various places that they can use as reminders to pause. So this is especially helpful for people that have challenges with impulse control. So they can post these around their homes to remind them, maybe to look at it and reflect, wait, do I want to do that? Maybe I don't want to open the refrigerator and eat this thing right now. But then also suggest that they switch it up pretty frequently, because after a while we become a little blind to seeing. They just blend into the environment and we don't see them anymore. A practice of morning intention setting can be really helpful. This can be done either, very quickly before one gets out of bed, a few breath cycles, and then a conversation with yourself around, how do I want to show up for my day? I typically, I really have a habit of interrupting people. I'm going to try today to be very mindful of not interrupting in those moments, and holding the thought and waiting until someone is done. And sometimes setting those kinds of intentions in the morning can help the person carry that mindfulness through the day. Similarly, the practice of reflecting in the evening on how the day went. I'm a big fan of journaling, especially with this population. So having the morning intention setting or the evening reflection being done in a journal format can really help consolidate that practice and help the client carry those intentions with them through the day and the next day. Instant replay. This exercise helps to strengthen awareness again. So what you're going to do with your client is have them close their eyes, do some breath cycles, and then ask them to take you through all of the moments that they went through to get to your office from their house. And I know it seems a little bit silly, but it's strengthening their working memory, and also forcing them to, through this visualization process, it's strengthening the mindfulness muscle again. Even though we're talking about what happened in the past, it's bringing a mindfulness, because you're going to be asking them, what were you feeling when you did this? What do you remember smelling? What do you remember touching? Okay. Next, we're going on to calm the mind and emotions. The column on the left can help to reduce anxiety and rejection-sensitive dysphoria. Make a fist exercise. So this one's super simple, but you're going to ask your clients to make a fist, and then you can't really see me in the screen, but they're going to hold their arms out while making the fist and try to keep their arms steady. And this is just another way of, especially if they're feeling a lot of anger, it's a way of getting that anger and frustration out, because it's kind of hard to keep the fist that way. And you can bring them through some breathing exercises, some body scans, and some tension releasing. Blocked breath can really be helpful for people outside session when they're trying to regulate themselves. And in a blocked breath exercise, you are purposely not allowing yourself to exhale, but you're trying to exhale, right? So you're fighting with yourself by taking a breath and then pretending you can't exhale. So it's causes you to feel a lot of stress. And then when you finally breathe, there's a release of that tension. Sensory box. I'm a big fan of a sensory box, especially for kids who have trouble regulating their big emotions. But adults can do this too. You're going to get have your client get a shoebox and fill the box with the things that address their senses in a pleasurable way. So something that they like to smell, something they like to touch, something that they like to listen to, something they like to look at. Taste can be a little bit challenging with the sensory box, so you can leave that one out. But in a moment where they're feeling highly dysregulated, having a quiet place to go to, pull the box out and simply bring themselves to this moment where they're engaging their senses can be extremely calming. I'm sorry I'm going through these so quickly, but I'm mindful of time. Mind reader challenge. So because of rejection sensitive dysphoria, a lot of times we'll assume that somebody set out to either reject us, not include us, offend us, when really wasn't their intention at all. So if you find your client has a lot of those feelings, this can also help with borderline clients, by the way. This would be to imagine a scenario where they recently had very hurt feelings, and if they can't come up with a scenario like that, then I take them through the exercise where I say, imagine you're walking down the street and you see a friend on the other side of the street. And you wave, but they scowl back at you. And what do you immediately assume? Or again, they're likely going to say they assume that they're mad at me. And then you're going to take them through what are all the other possible reasons you can think of that they might have scowled. And then hopefully they'll come up with things like the sun's in their eyes, they're having a bad day, they just tasted something bad, things that don't involve them, as a way of strengthening this awareness that not everyone else's experience has anything to do with your client. The yes, but exercise reinforces your client's ability to accept compliments. So, for example, if they are very dismissive of compliments, you want to take them back to a time when somebody did compliment them on something, and have them rework that moment by role playing with you, or just saying out loud during the exercise with their eyes closed, their ability to accept the compliment for whatever it was. And then increasing self-compassion and emotional regulation. The when you were a child exercise, also one of my favorites. I like to bring the client back to imagining themselves as a child, because especially for undiagnosed adults, they may have spent a very painful childhood. And so going back and imagining themselves as a child, and they're either going to write a letter to that child or maybe just talk to you out loud in session about what they would say to that child. And the types of things that the way you want to focus them on this discussion is by telling the child that their adult self sees them. Their adult self understands how hard it was and how much they were trying and how misunderstood they felt. And to tell them that it, well, I mean, you don't have to say it gets better if it's not better for them, that essentially it's an exercise of seeing the child, because probably nobody ever saw the child. And so you're having their adult self do it. And they can also write a letter to their future self or have of their future self write a letter to their current self, telling them that they're seen and they know how hard they're trying in a similar way. The challenge mantra, healthy mantra, you can ignore the 82. That's my own note to myself. That is so that you write a list of the challenges that they have, whatever they feel like they're dealing with it, their ADHD is impacting, and then the opposite of what those challenges are. If they were functioning in a better way, what would they be doing? And the mantra that they're going to recite to themselves is something like, this particular challenge is a moment of suffering, and it's a part of my life, and I'm deserving of compassion for it, just like anyone else, because I'm trying. And then the healthy mantra is, I'm trying to be one who, and then you substitute whatever the functioning thing is, that the way that they're trying to be. I'm trying to be one who organizes themselves better. I'm trying to be one who doesn't forget appointments. I'm trying to be one who shows up on time. And then have them write this down as a mantra that they repeat to themselves. The wonderful list. So this is a play on the children's book I wrote, My Rolling Twirling Motor, where at the boy takes you through his day, and he takes you through all of the ways in which his ADHD causes him to mess up. And at the end of the day, he thinks he's going to get in trouble from his mom, but instead she reads to him a list of everything he did right that day, and she calls it his wonderful list. This is one of the first go-to interventions that I use with my parent clients, but it can also be really good for adult clients because they spend so much time beating themselves up. Having them work through a list that they call their wonderful list, which is all of the ways in which they are successful, all of the things that they're doing well, to try to reorient them toward that positivity that also exists in their life that they so easily discount. Hug Your Monster is the notion that the hurtful thoughts that they have toward themselves are probably sourced from pain. And so this exercise has them visualize that pain as a monster who's actually hurting. And then you're going to have your client visualize themselves going over and giving that hurting monster a big hug. Again, as a way of generating some self-compassion. And goodbye to the inner critic. That's another visualization where you're explaining to your client that our inner critic is often a way of protecting ourselves from making mistakes in the future. And it thinks it's doing us a disservice because it feels like its job is to protect us, but when in fact, all it does is wind up hurting us. So we're going to thank our inner critic for trying really hard to do a great job, but we're firing it. And we want to visualize this inner critic actually packing a suitcase, getting on an airplane. You're waving goodbye to the inner critic. And then as a replacement, you're going to invite compassion to fill the hole where the inner critic was. Okay. Phew. Those are 20 mindfulness exercises that hopefully can help your clients. And that brings me to pretty much the end of that presentation. I can go on and talk a little bit about parent behavior therapy and why we use that and what appropriate referrals might be. But at this point, I don't know, Adrienne, if we have questions and you want to jump in.
Yes, we do have a few minutes, so I'll maybe try and get in a couple questions. Does that work for you?
Yeah, great.
So one thing, just kind of more practical, I think clinicians love like tools, and you've given us, you said 20, these were 20.
Yeah.
Did you publish these with descriptions and all of that? Is this somewhere like other than the recorded presentation that they can access? Because we have lots of folks asking more. Oh,
well,
okay.
Yeah, so they are all in here, and I'm not trying to push this because
Yeah.
I actually don't get royalties off this book or anything. So, buy it, don't buy it, I don't care. But they are all in here.
Okay.
Um
Awesome.
and yeah.
Thanks for sharing all of those. I can see how they would be really helpful, especially with kiddos. We had one question about, when you were talking about talking about the good things with the one book. That was kind of cool, the list that the mom shared. We had somebody ask just a second ago, how do you get them to believe good things or in reframing things? I find this to be really difficult.
How do you get I'm wondering if they mean adult clients? How do you get adult clients to believe good things, or
I don't know,
kids?
maybe both. I could see it, kind of applying to both. Like when we're trying to share the good things, how do we kind of help folks let that in? I guess maybe is another way to say it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I definitely find that it's got to come from within them. So, for adult clients, you know, anything coming from the clinician is maybe going to sound like an empty platitude, but having them work on something like, maybe you incorporate into your session 5 minutes to talk about, well, what did you do today that you felt was successful? Because of course they're going to come in and want to talk about all the ways in which life is falling apart, but routinely incorporating at least a few minutes to focus on the positives that are happening in their life, taking them back to their childhood around ways in which they felt successful, and really trying to, at least for some small moments, ground them in ways that they feel that success. Because if they can come up with it themselves, it's going to be a lot stronger than if you're the one reminding them of it. However, if you're working with parents, then it is the parent that has to be the one who's constantly pointing it out for the child. And the parent has to really try to break the habit of going to the correction first, because parents, they want to shape their child's behavior, they want to put forth functioning adults in the world, and so they take this responsibilities very seriously. But unfortunately it usually backfires and winds up creating this feeling in the child that, well, everyone thinks I'm bad, I might as well be bad. So letting the small things go, especially if it doesn't have anything to do with physical aggression, letting those things go, especially during this adjustment phase where you're trying to focus only on what you're finding your child doing right. And they are doing things right all day. We just usually expect them, and so we don't point them out. And noticing, oh, great job, you cleared your plate, great job, you picked up your socks, great, you got to the door, to leave for school on time, and pointing those things out.
Awesome.
Hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, it's really helpful. Thank you. We had a couple of folks ask about some of the, I don't know, maybe overlapping symptomology related to autism, ADHD. I thought it was interesting because you recorded a separate section or a separate session on autism specifically. Can you talk briefly about that though?
Yeah, it can get very confusing because there are a lot of overlapping symptoms, and there are a lot of co-occurring diagnoses. So, but one thing to really understand that's very different is this executive functioning piece. People diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder who don't have ADHD don't usually have the same kind of struggles with organization and planning and paying attention and controlling their impulses, the way in which someone with an ADHD diagnosis has. And people with an ADHD diagnosis don't necessarily have the deficits in understanding nonverbal cues. They don't have the same kind of, they might have social problems, but what's informing those social problems isn't the same thing. So for someone with ADHD, the social problem might come because they make annoying noises and they don't pay attention and they're constantly doing something impulsive that drives someone crazy. But for somebody with autism spectrum, the social problem comes because there's a difficulty in reading the social cues. And where some of the overlap comes is more in ASD's restricted and repetitive behaviors, because that's where we see the rigidity of thinking and the hyper focus and wanting to talk about the same thing, and maybe not noticing if somebody has lost interest in what they're saying, which can sort of look like they're not paying attention. And that can look like ADHD's hyper focused because they're super interested in something and their brain's getting flooded with dopamine. So I don't know if that was helpful. But...
Yeah, no, it's really helpful. And it kind of makes me think of just one last question, if we could squeeze it in, just in terms of working with families. Like, I know with ADHD, you know, you're working with the person who has the diagnosis, and yet it's so important, like the systems involved be informed, and like you were talking about, compassionate and making space, right, for neurodiversity in families. Any like wisdom or tips based on how to get the families involved?
Well, this is particularly challenging if you work with children and, you know, you're finding that they've dropped their child off because they want you to fix the kid's ADHD. And unfortunately, the reality is that's just not going to be within your wheelhouse, because it's a neurological condition and the child has impulse control issues that are going to happen outside your session. They're not going to be able to generalize anything you teach them in 1 hour a week of working with you to the rest of their life. If they could do that, they wouldn't have ADHD. And so really explaining to the parents that if they're bringing your child there to work on self-esteem issues, anxiety that might be co-occurring with the ADHD, those are probably things that you can help with. But unless you're an executive functioning coach and you're specifically working on, okay, how are we going to organize you around your homework? And, you know, what are ways that we can help you remember things? And, you know, we're going to use timers and charts and things like that. Then as a clinician, your hands are going to be somewhat tied in impacting ADHD symptoms. And so really making sure that the parents understand what they're asking for and what is, you know, reality in terms of what you can deliver. And that especially for younger children, the work really is with the parent if they're trying to impact ADHD symptoms, because they have to manage the child's environment. They have to manage what they're requesting of the child. They have to really understand the child's unmet need and how the ADHD is impacting the behavior in order to shape that behavior. That's the first thing. If you're working with an adult client, especially one who's in relationship with another, it might be helpful to get a release and invite that person into one session to actually talk about the ADHD and how it might be impacting the relationship. Because if they can increase their compassion around understanding that, look, when he forgets to take the trash out, he is not dissing you. It is not an intentional like disrespect. It really is a struggle that he has around ADHD to remember this thing. So what are tips and tricks we can do in the home to help him remember? But if he forgets, it's not personal.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We are at time, so we're gonna wrap this up. You mentioned, and I'm blanking. I've heard about it and read it before, but the parent. Can you name the therapy related to parent?
Parent behavior therapy.
Parent behavior therapy. That is something you were going to talk more about, but we ran out of time. So
I did. I mean, I think I just talked about it. Yeah,
okay,
just in that last.
Yeah. So if folks are interested, then go check that out. Miriam, thank you so much for being here and closing out our summit. You were the last person of the day. That's not an easy.
You made it. You did it.
It's not an easy role. So I appreciate you coming in here at the end. You were totally worth the wait. So thank you so much.